Hello again. I want to pose a very serious question for viewers. For almost the whole of human history, with rare and fleeting exceptions, men and women have been regarded as very different. Different bodies, different kinds of mind, different roles, different interests, and so on. For a few decades in Western society, we have upended all this. We began in the late 1960s by advancing the idea that the only difference between men and women were purely social ones, and that in fact there were no essential differences between them at all. This was also, by the way, the foundation of the idea that the only differences between ethnic groups were similarly social, and that race was a social construct. Now, many people claim that both gender and race are just social constructs. The two theories go hand in hand. This idea about men and women and gender, which ran counter, by the way, to history and science, progressed until we've reached a point where the very distinctions men and women became blurred, until they were it was wholly erased. There were no longer two distinct human genders, but more than 100. So it came to be believed by some that male and female were not categories at all, but that human gender was a spectrum. This is the concept of what is sometimes described as non-binary. All this is being presented as though it were in the nature of a scientific discovery, which means that the future for men and women in gender roles will be very different from what they have traditionally been in the past. Here is the question I want to ask. Do viewers think that the strange ideas which have emerged over the last 50 years or so in Britain and the United States are genuinely a revolution in thinking about gender? Something which will alter forever the way that men and women are viewed over the next 1,000 years or so? Or do they rather think that it is an aberration, the kind of peculiar belief which rears its head in societies which have lost their way? Something which future generations might look back on and say, what on earth were we thinking? The reason I ask this question is that I was thinking the other day about the Roman Empire and some of the bizarre things which happened there. We're all of us aware, I suppose, that the idea has been around for a long time, that when the ordinary people had enough food in their bellies and were provided with sufficient entertainment, then they would be quiescent and not challenge the established order. This has famously been described as bread and circuses. Well, the citizens of the West certainly have their bread and circuses today. Nobody starves in Europe and America, and Lord knows they are entertained enough by television, Twitter, Facebook, and indeed YouTube. It was said by people like Gibbon in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire that this state of affairs led to a degenerate society where people didn't want to fight anymore for the values of their society. They just wanted to lounge around all day watching gladiatorial combats or scrolling through TikTok or Instagram. One of the odd echoes of those days which we see today are what we now describe as trans women, men who dress as women and sometimes are surgically altered so that their bodies can be transformed into a crude physical representation or approximation of the female form. Perhaps viewers have been persuaded that this is a modern idea. In fact, the Romans were quite at home with sex changes and trans women. Most of us have heard of the Emperor Nero, whose reign is often thought of as marking a decline in Roman values and the beginning of the slide into decadence and degeneracy for Rome. He was a believer in the idea of trans women, and he actually married one. The person he married was a young man called Sporus, and it was arranged that Sporus should undergo what today we call sexual reassignment surgery. He was castrated to make him look more like a woman, following which he dressed as a woman all the time. Nero married Sporus, who then began to be addressed as the Empress. None of this raised eyebrows in ancient Rome, because most people were too busy watching shows at the Colosseum to be able to work up any indignation at such goings-on. It was simply accepted as one of those things. After Nero's death, another man married Sporus, who by now was accepted by everybody as a woman. Until recently, capers like this were seen as a sign that Rome must have been on a downward spiral. Imagine a man being castrated and then dressing as a woman and everybody calling him she. As late as the 1980s, this is how that episode was thought of generally. Mark how things have now changed, though, and it doesn't cause anybody any surprise at all to read about the case. I think this may be because we are in a similar situation to Rome at that time. That what has for thousands of years been regarded as an act of monstrous perversion is today seen as normal and unremarkable behaviour tells us something very alarming about the state of our society.